focus of today's proceedings is the tradition of official military history that been founded. With the greatest respect to my hosts, I'm going to partially challenge that notion before I'm even done with my introduction. As we've heard across the conference, Bean was a talented and driven individual whose volumes of the official history of Australia and the Great War still stand as one of the most sustained and influential examples of Australian historiography, military or otherwise. As the historians in the room will acknowledge, however, an historian's work is only as strong as their sources, and thus the great historians often rise upon the shoulders of others. Thus, I would argue that the legacy that we both analyse and celebrate today is in part the legacy of Bean's contemporaries, such as John Treloar and the men and women of the Australian War Record section that created the copious archive from which Bean worked. Acknowledging the role of the Australian War Record section, we must disregard our notions of Australian exceptionalism and recognise that the foundation of the Australian tradition of official history lies with the establishment of systematic operational record-keeping practices by the British Army. It is to discuss the modern manifestation of operational record-keeping that I stand here this afternoon. Although I've worked on 2 Australian official history projects as a research assistant for the official history of Australia's involvement in Southeast Asian conflicts, and as a research assistant and author for the official history of Australian peacekeeping, humanitarian and post-Cold War operations, this paper is about my time as an operational record keeper on the staff of Headquarters 6th United Kingdom Division, which in 2010 deployed to assume command of Regional Command South in Afghanistan. In its essence, the work that I undertook was little different to that undertaken by Treloar's team to produce, quote, records that could be used for historical purposes, unquote. And they're Treloar's words, not mine. But the form and volume of those records left me with a foreboding impression that we are ill-equipped to deal with the challenges of doing history in the digital age. Before moving on to discussing what I did, a little context is required. In my experience, knowledge of the organisation of the war in Afghanistan is limited in Australia. Following a pattern established by much of the writing about Australia in the Vietnam War, Uruzgan has become Afghanistan and Afghanistan has become Uruzgan. There are some vague and occasional mentions of the Dutch, whose abilities are usually compared negatively to Australian military prowess. But one would be forgiven for thinking that Australia waged an independent campaign. Established by United Nations Security Council resolution in December 2001 and led by NATO, the International Security Assistance Force, ISAF, was originally intended to train Afghan security forces, but progressively found itself fighting a counterinsurgency campaign against a resurgent Taliban. When I arrived in Afghanistan in 2010, ISAF was organised into 5 regional commands. So, RC North, RC East, RC Capital around Kabul, RC South where I was working, and RC West. And you see all the flags there representing the various nations' contributing forces. Encompassing a large proportion of Afghanistan's Pashtun belt and being the source of approximately half of Afghanistan's opium production, RC South was critical to ISAF's campaign. So it's RC South there, including the provinces of Daikundi, obviously important for Australia, Uruzgan there, Zabul, Kandahar, Helmand, and Nimruz. And RC South has had 3 significant features. There's the Helmand River Green Zone through here, basically developed as by the Americans in the 1950s aid project. Then we have Kandahar City, the spiritual home of the Taliban and the second largest city in Afghanistan, plus the border crossing down here at Spin Boldak, which then provided one of the main logistical routes from Pakistan into ISAF's operating areas. So that's the green zone, the Helmand River green zone, Kandahar City, and the border crossing at Spinboldak. Headquarters RC South was based at Kandahar Airfield, known all inside its fences as CAF, the second largest ISAF base, and in 2010 the busiest single runway airfield in the world. Representing the major troop contributing nations at its establishment in 2006, the command of RC South rotated annually between Canada, the Netherlands and the United Kingdom. In 2010, the commander was Major General Nick Carter, who is currently the United Kingdom's Chief of the General Staff. The major troop contributing nations in diminishing order were the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, the Netherlands, Australia, Romania, Denmark, Georgia and Estonia. 2010 was a critical period in the campaign in southern Afghanistan. Regional Command South was ISAF's main effort and was the principal recipient of the majority of the additional troops committed as part of the surge announced by President Obama in 2009. At the height of its strength, before Helmand and Nimruz were hived off to form a separate command in July, it included 65,000 personnel. General Carter's campaign plan General Carter's campaign plan involved first building on the hard-won success of the previous year by clearing insurgents from central Helmand and strengthening governance there, codenamed Operation Mushtarak, prior to the commencement of a comprehensive military process. It was repeatedly emphasised to us that it was not just a military operation to increase security and improve governance in Kandahar City. This activity later became known as Hamkari. You will note I've made no mention of Uruzgan. Operations there were very much an economy of force effort, and the province didn't even feature in the campaign plan schematic. 2010 saw a level of military activity in RC South that was unprecedented in the war. The opening morning of Mushtarak, the 13th of February 2010, featured the largest heli-borne assault since the Vietnam War. And the scale of operations in the command's area of operations led to the decision to it being split in two. So you can see there, split down the middle with Helmand and Nimruz being transferred to RC Southwest under the command of the US Marine Corps, and headquarters in Kandahar remaining control of RC South with Kandahar, Zabul, Uruzgan and Daikundi. The Taliban responded in kind, and its summer offensive reached an intensity unmatched in the previous years. ISAF's casualties for 2010 were the highest of the entire war. For all of its activity, 2010 can also be seen as the beginning of ISAF's drawdown. Netherlands forces, with the exception of some limited aviation elements, completed their withdrawal from Uruzgan in August. And in November, Canada announced its intention to withdraw its combat forces, reduce its contribution and refocus its training. Unlike Bean on the first morning of Gallipoli, I did not ride into Marja with the Marines on the first morning of Operation Mushtarak. In an exemplar of my war, in which I rarely ventured beyond the wire at CAF, I watched the first actions of the operation unfold on grainy video feeds provided by a dozen orbiting unmanned aerial vehicles in a hut in the headquarters compound. The vast majority of my time was spent in another plywood hut at CAF, working to compile Regional Command South's operational record. This record was essentially what we historians of earlier wars know as a war diary, and indeed my colleagues and I were still quaintly referred to as war diarists. Returning momentarily to the British tradition of operational record keeping, the war diary originated in a suite of reforms implemented in the early 20th century in response to perceptions of relatively poor performance in the Boer War. Issued in April 1909, Part 2 of Field Service Regulations stipulated that every unit in formation, upon mobilisation for active service, would maintain a daily war diary for the purposes of furnishing, quote, an accurate record of the operations for which the history of the war could be prepared, unquote, and, quote, to collect information for future reference with a view to effecting improvements in the organisation, training, equipment and administration of the Army for war, unquote. NATO's operational record keeping was heavily influenced by British practice, and the endurance of the war diary concept, first articulated in 1909, was obvious in ISAF's standard operating procedures relating to operational record keeping. And I quote, "The operational record provides a continuous and accurate account of ISAF's role and achievements that can be presented to our higher formations and troop contributing nations' governments. The op record is preserved irrespective of security classification or special handling caveats for future uses such as mission rehearsals and historical analysis, for legal purposes should the need arise, and provides a key source of reference material for historic research by academics." In its basic form, the war diary heritage of the operational record was still apparent. It consisted of two components, the daily overview and the daily reference structure, which essentially equated to, respectively, the narrative and appendices of the historical war diary, albeit in digital form. We maintained no paper records, and anything received in hard copy was scanned and stored electronically. The daily overview provided a narrative summary of each day's events, although it was more structured than a historical war diary and contained sections detailing events in the headquarters, including summaries of significant meetings, information received from higher headquarters and from flanking and subordinate formations, including summaries of the day's significant events, weather observations, details of casualties and detainees, visitors to the headquarters, media reporting, and other orders issued. The reference structure was a collection of documents filed corresponding to the various staff branches of the headquarters and hyperlinked to the daily narrative. The operational record keeping team was small, just 2 people, and we were both civil servants. The senior war diarist was to attend significant meetings and briefings within the headquarters, provide summaries of these for the operational record, exercise quality control over the operational record, and act as the primary liaison between the team and the rest of the headquarters. The war diarist was less mobile. Their job was to compile the daily overview, conduct a daily search of the headquarters electronic filing system to identify key documents for inclusion in the daily reference structure. During my deployment, I filled both roles. Although demanding, the war diarist's role was relatively straightforward. The principal challenge was completing the day's work in the time available. The volume of documentation produced by the headquarters was extraordinary, and we were just looking at a fraction of it. There were multiple computer networks operating in the headquarters, and we focused on just one, the Iaf Secret Network, also known as Mission Secret. Just to explain this here, that's the network here that we worked off, within the headquarters being a combination of NATO and American formations, that the Americans operated 2 systems, their secret network and their unclassified network, at which nobody apart from Americans got access to, although their units and formations continued to do a lot of their business on them. That there was also a NATO unclassified network that we didn't work on, and obviously out in the weeds, a lot of the other troop contributing nations were maintaining their own computer networks, which linked in to varying degrees to the ISAF mission network. The day's search of the RC South working directory on the mission secret system could yield from 1,000 to 3,000 documents which had been changed in the previous 24 hours, from which 300 to 500 were usually selected for inclusion in the operational record. The daily overview was compiled largely from routine reporting, the quality of which varied. Time constraints provided little scope to resolve contradictions and fill gaps, but my combined historical and military experience proved useful in this regard, as it directed me to a variety of other documents that could be used to supplement the daily situation reports. In the senior war diarist's role, detailed knowledge of the command's campaign plan and familiarity with the structure of the headquarters and its battle rhythm was essential. Time was the enemy, and identifying the most relevant planning and decision-making forums was critical. Every meeting attended had to be summarised, and the challenge that I never quite mastered was striking an effective balance between providing detail and conveying overall intent. In this instance, I was hampered, I think, by my professional experience, because in an effort to maximise the utility of the operational record I was producing, I would ask myself, what would an historian want to know? And the answer was always more than I had time to write. Time became particularly tight as Hamkari was planned and executed. Its multifaceted nature entailed a number of lengthy conferences, and the combined approach taken, Hamkari, translated as cooperation in Pashto and Dari, resulted in meetings outside of CAF that necessitated several hours of travelling time and the potential for being stranded should the weather stop helicopter flights. The pace was relentless, and even working 17-hour days, I struggled to keep up. The operational record-keeping team had no built-in redundancy, and as the operational tempo accelerated, worked at the very limits of its capacity. Fortunately, we managed to avoid serious illness. Had either member of the team been struck down, then the scope of the operational record would have been curtailed. Ideally, a third member of the team would have provided the ability to manage such an occurrence, as well as the capacity to bolster the information provided in the daily situation reports and create nested sub-collections of records. In quieter times, through a combination of both directed searching of the Mission Secret Network and liaison around the headquarters, we were able to link a variety of digital records, briefing slides, air tasking orders, recordings of aircraft and UAV video feeds, situation reports and more detailed after-action reports to the daily narrative to provide more detailed coverage of particular events. The work of the operational record-keeping team was generally well supported within the headquarters, and there were few forums from which we were barred. Access was granted at the highest level, and as the senior war diarist, I was a routine attendee at General Carter's conferences with his command team and his weekly teleconferences with the commander of the ISAF Joint Command. The only exception was the Special Forces coordination element within the headquarters. The senior war diarist was generally given access to special operations conferences, but PowerPoint slides and other documents were almost routinely withheld. My experience with the Special Forces also serves to highlight the fact that cultivating working relationships with headquarters staff was essential. We've heard across the past 2 days how Bean's relationships with the staff of the AIF were equally important for furthering his work. Some in the headquarters were suspicious of our presence, and others just innocently ignorant of who we were and what we did. Our work was often facilitated by just turning up at conferences and appearing as part of the furniture, which is how I first managed to penetrate the Special Forces conferences. But it also helped to have supporters. In the case of the Special Forces, I struck up a conversation with an Australian SAS regiment officer, worked out we had a mutual acquaintance, and then henceforth I always made sure I sat next to him when I arrived for that conference. Building such relationships could be hard work, however. Those I've worked with over the years know I'm not the most socially adept individual, and Bean's shyness struck a chord with me when it was mentioned yesterday. I also gained an insight into the replacement phenomena, which is oft commented on by military historians, particularly when exploring unit cohesion. In order to ensure continuity, all of the principal appointments in the headquarters were on 12-month deployments. The war diarists, however, were deployed for shorter terms. I missed the headquarters work-up exercise in Germany because I was back home in Australia at the time, and then rotated into the headquarters several months into the deployment. I never felt I enjoyed the same familiarity among the other headquarters staff as did my predecessor, who joined the exercise in Germany, and there he tested and refined his procedures like every other part of the headquarters, and he then deployed with it. Nevertheless, building awareness of our operational record keeping yielded results. Once staff knew who we were and what we were about, they became adjuncts to our section. I'm reminded of Treloar's reflection on his effort to encourage ordinary soldiers to collect on behalf of the Australian War Record Section. Quote, "Every soldier went into action with a pocket full of museum labels." Staff would email us briefing notes and slide decks and bring us copies of files that were not on the network that we routinely accessed. And they would invite us to conferences that we were not aware of. As I mentioned earlier, even though we needed to exercise discretion as to what we attended, it was still useful to know what was going on. Having outlined how our section worked, I'll briefly discuss some of the other historical and record-keeping activity that I was aware of while deployed. In both its task force headquarters and its units, the British Army maintained similar operational records to that we had at RC South, but they were compiled by uniformed personnel. The British had no historical personnel working in the field with their troops. The United States deployed its units and formations with dedicated historical officers, tasked with both providing commanders with historically based advice and collecting historical material. Further, the Americans deployed military history detachments to join units in the field and supplement their correction efforts. It should be noted that the United States Army draws a distinction between official records and historical material. The former being material produced, quote, by a command or unit carrying out their missions, unquote, and the latter material, quote, that recounts the planning and execution of operations or actions. Official records are maintained through the Army Records Information Management System and are the responsibility of a unit records manager and not the historical officers. In recent communications, however, an official from the US Army Centre of Military History informed me that due to the limitations of electronic data systems and the inability to store large amounts of data in theatre, the official records of operations in Afghanistan were not adequately corrected by the Army's Record Management and Declassification Agency during the period from 2002 to 2013, and the historical material collected by unit historians and the military history detachments, amounting to 123 million files, has become the de facto official record. Before closing, allow me to reflect on the nature of my war in Afghanistan. Unlike Bean, I was not confronted with the visceral reality of war, overloading my senses and pummeling my emotions. I didn't move among soldiers in the field, much to my frustration, as a long-time admirer of Long's work, and thus find it hard to include myself in the same tradition as Bean. For the most part, it was a detached academic experience. I dealt with numbers and symbols on maps and accounts written in the clipped, acronym-laden prose of military reporting. I saw people die, but they were ghostly figures on thermal imagery, and inside our plywood hut, with its fridge and its air conditioner, it took a great effort of the imagination to relate them to real flesh and blood human beings. I was never directly shot at. The butts of a rifle range remain the only place I've heard the crack thump of live rounds. CAF routinely came under rocket fire from the Taliban, but their general inaccuracy made us rather blasé about the potential effect. Flight time from the launching area to CAF was generally about 7 seconds, and the drill upon hearing the alarm was to hit the floor, cover your head, and wait for the bang. That's why they were so inaccurate, because they were generally just propped up and pointed in the direction. And then that's what we did when the alarm went off. Then, if there was no further alarms, one was meant to don body armour and helmet and proceed to a shelter and wait until the all clear was sounded, which could sometimes take hours. Our own drill was to wait a couple of minutes, don the body armour and go back to work. It perhaps says something of my particular psyche that I never felt afraid for my life, but I spent a great deal of time getting very worked up about the quality of the operational record and the fact I was falling behind. Some of the reports I handled cut through the reality, however. The two I recall most clearly both feature the weapon that has come to symbolise the war in southern Afghanistan, the Ubiquitous Ied. The first incident struck me because of its ordinariness, its random cruelty. An armoured vehicle stopped to allow one of its passengers to urinate, and his first step outside of the vehicle and his last step in this world was onto the pressure plate of an IED. The impact of the second incident lay in its sheer horror. An IED detonation initiated a short firefight. A member of the patrol was found to be missing. Standard operating procedures for a kidnapped soldier were put in motion. Before too long, however, more reporting came through that a broader search of the contact area had revealed that the missing soldier had literally been blown to smithereens. At the time, I was conscious of my tendency to view it all as an academic exercise, and thus made the point of going down to the ramp ceremonies that were held on the tarmac a few minutes' walk from the headquarters, when the bodies of service personnel killed were repatriated. It served as a reminder of just what the casualty figures that we totalled up each day and what the eggs on the map marked control and protect and deny and interdict really meant. What is the abiding legacy of my time in Afghanistan? For a while, it was a tendency to dive for the floor when a fire alarm went off. Fortunately, that has passed. Even before I worked in the United Kingdom, I was sceptical of the nationalist meta-narrative of Australian military history. I left Afghanistan even more wary of parochialism. Yes, small nations must tell their own stories, but they must do so in their proper context. Returning to the theme of doing history in the digital age, many of the challenges we faced would have been familiar to Bean, Treloar and Long. To sift, collate and organise records and build awareness of the significance of our work. But we faced a rapidly multiplying fractal landscape of digital documentation. Our operational record was limited in its scope. It was impersonal. And perhaps the fact that troubles me says something of the impact of Bean's legacy. I'm sure that some bits of it were wrong, but at least it provided some sort of map to this digital landscape. Writing about the efforts of Treloar and the Australian War Record section in an article in the Australian War Memorials magazine, Anne-Marie Condé, whom we heard from yesterday, observed, and I quote, "It is not enough to expect the evidence of the past to be preserved as a matter of chance or accident. Someone has to care," unquote. It is not enough to simply rely on shipping home pallets of hard drives. Someone has to care. There needs to be a dedicated staff in theatre, a modern-day war record section deployed for the duration of the mission, sorting, collating and synthesising in real time so that the records are in immediately usable fashion for those who will build upon Bean's legacy. Thank you.
Just a question about software.
Yeah.
Is the existence of some software which is classified in its operation going to cause problems in the future that no one previously has to deal with? So you can't access the data because you haven't got the software to make sense of it, and who then will declassify the software, or is it in fact associated with some commercial enterprise who never want to see that happen without a substantial payment? Can you comment on that?
This is a real mess. I look back, I'm a bit like Bean and Treloar. I collect stuff. I've still got my work from university on 5.25 inch floppy disks. I still have all my work from the army immediately after I left the War Memorial as a summer scholar in 95 and 96. We worked on a thing called AmyPro then. I have a whole bunch of documents in AmyPro, but does AmyPro still exist?
The camera will now show all these horrified faces here in the gallery.
That, I think, partly it is. Some of these things that were used in theatre, particularly that the intelligence people use, are very specific proprietary systems. Things like Analyst's Notebook. I've got no idea what the form of the file of an Analyst's Notebook is. We didn't actually get to see a lot of the product that the intelligence people used. A lot of the day-to-day commerce of the headquarters was done on standard Microsoft Word, Excel, PowerPoint. But in the end, we're all then at the mercy of Microsoft Corporation, who updates their software year after year after year, supposedly provide more functionality, but the conspiracist in me says that it's so that we have to buy new versions of it. Technology changes, and just in my limited time in this profession, we've gone from 5.2-inch drives, 5.25 drives to 3.5, to CDs, to now we're moving to solid-state drives. In my work for David, I found 3.25, 3.5 floppies in files. You know, I couldn't get into them with the thing. So I think it's both the platform and it's the software and it's the manner in which this stuff is stored that it's a whole bunch of problems that I don't think anybody necessarily has a solution for.
So challenges to which we've not yet risen.
I don't think so. I think we're sort of, and the archivists among us can probably tell, I'm sure that their archival organisations are working on common standards such as PDFs for documents, etc. But again, something that we adopt as a standard now may not be maintained as a standard in 10 years' time, but paper is paper. It lasts for ever.
Thank you. Craig Wilcox.
Garth, that was wonderful. That was so informed and so insightful and so humble as you usually are. But I wonder whether you weren't too humble, because you were suggesting that you weren't quite up there with the being legacy because he was in, or almost in, the front line. But you were in the front line in a new kind of war, which is digital. It is inside an air-conditioned kind of building. Most of the troops, I assume, or few troops will, increasingly will ever see any, or ever take part in any physical combat. It will be conducted more and more in the way that you were. So, in a sense, you are the Charles Bean, aren't you? You are now part of the typical experience of an ADF member.
Yeah, I was thinking about this last night, that in some ways, me in the ops centre at RC South on the first morning of Mustarak, watching the UAV feeds, I'm not that much different to that very famous picture that we have of Bean, and we learned how after the experience of Pozieres that Bean sort of absented himself from the immediate front line, found a vantage point and watched. And then in essence, yeah, okay, that's what I was doing. But then I think part of this also comes from my own experience, that I'm a Second World War historian to begin with. I'm a tremendous admirer of the work of Gavin Long. My thesis is based upon a lot of his diaries and his notebooks, and of a man who moved amongst the forward troops, interviewing, speaking, climbing up Parramatta at Balikpapan, etc. And I think that has that typecasts what I think an operational historian should be. And there are still a lot of soldiers out there who are closing with the enemy, who are engaging in very tough, bitter, living off hard rations, fighting, etc. And I think sometimes that's what we are now losing, particularly with armies that don't put people into the field regularly now to capture their experiences like Long did.
Thanks so much, Garth. You mentioned a few shortcomings in your own experience. I wish there was an Australian version of you doing things in every kind of province, but there wasn't. I just wanted to make a comment about Tom's question about software. Now, I often hear stories about how much the sky is falling, right, with modern day records management or lack thereof, and the various proprietary softwares, all of which you suggest is absolutely correct in my limited experience. But just because something's different in terms of its challenge doesn't mean it's insurmountable or necessarily worse. Big data, for example, is not a new problem for modern day academics in IT. Where there is armour, there is anti-armour. Where there is a problem, there is a solution. And there are some solutions to the types of challenges with outdated software. I'm not going to preempt too much of what I'm going to say this afternoon, nor shine a ray of sunshine when none exists. But I'm a bit tired of hearing about how insurmountable and how the end of history type narrative is happening here. That's not the case. I'm sure they were talking about that when parchment turned into paper, right? There are just as many advantages with electronic records as there are disadvantages in my own limited experience so far. The software, there are ways past the software system that even organisations like DSG, I was going to say DSTO, are working on right now. That's just a comment more than anything else.
Yeah, I wouldn't like to sort of to be interpreted. I think the sky is falling. I think we've allowed this problem to fall on top of us. We knew it was coming. We've known it was coming since the 1991 Gulf War. Something that wasn't in the paper is that basically there's what provokes the record-keeping practices that NATO was applying in Afghanistan was particularly British and American experience in the 1991 Gulf War, where it is in some ways a dark age because the material just wasn't saved. But the other thing I would say too is that there is a challenge. We need to rise to the challenge, but we're not addressing the challenge Instead, we're spending millions and millions of dollars on First World War commemorative centres and flashes in the pan, like the modern day version of Australia Remembers. Who remembers what the legacy of Australia Remembers is? Who will remember what the legacy of the Anzac Centenary was? Whereas if you spent the money on the Anzac Centenary in addressing the issues of digital records and how to handle big data, you would have a real lasting legacy to say, like Bean's last paragraph, here is their record, their deeds stand or fall. You provide the means to do it in the same way that perhaps Bean did back in the First World War. I really think it's time that the First World War is 100 years gone. The people whose stories, it is now enshrined for ages. There's a whole generation of Australian service people who we need to address these challenges so we can tell their story.
Hi Larry, it was a great paper, Colin Gannett here. You alluded to a specific problem that we are going to be facing in the near future, and that is switching from software to hardware. You alluded to the floppy drive issue. I think in the future we are going to have a significant problem with storage and digital storage of vast archives. We are starting to see, in specific cases of hard drives, IDE drives are no longer going to be able to be read because motherboard manufacturers are not making IDE drives readable anymore. They don't have the specific drivers on the motherboards. I know, sorry, that's getting quite technical, but if you store all your data on those drives, they're no longer going to be readable. That's going to be an issue moving forward. We are going through a very quick revolution of storage here with solid-state drives, as you mentioned. Do you see any challenges going forward in having all this data on those mediums?
That's starting to sort of step beyond the technical capabilities of the humble historian. But I think it goes back to what Craig was saying before, that I don't think we're necessarily dealing with an insurmountable problem, but it's a problem that requires resources and attention. And the fact that it's associated with history, I don't know whether it necessarily gets that, but then there are big data issues that other people are playing with, so then it is maybe taking that technology across. But it is a sense where, as you say, technology is evolving rapidly. We need to be dealing with this now and quickly and have resources devoted to it. And that's my main issue. I don't think just in the general scheme, from what I've observed, that military organisations are devoting the appropriate attention to their operational record keeping.
Of which that's one factor.
Of which, exactly.
Thanks very much. It's Chris again. Thank you for a very candid paper. I think that was a very insightful presentation. I guess two aspects to what I'm going to ask. I mean, I think part of the theme of today has been to what extent the Bean tradition has carried on and what is his legacy. And it seems to me, and I wonder if you'd agree, that the role that you carried out is actually helping to preserve records that otherwise might not exist. And coming back to Anne-Marie's quote, that caring for the records is actually actively helping to retain the record, which otherwise might not happen. That's the first part. The second part is, and this is not a hostile question, but just wondering, given the volume of material, whether you felt that the normal sort of quality control, the cross-checking, was it even possible to do that, or did you have to take a lot on trust? There wasn't, and I was saying in the paper, there wasn't really the scope for us to, if you didn't get a day's record done in the day, you were falling behind, and then you were falling behind, and you're falling behind, and you're falling behind. That it was a limited act of synthesis that we were doing, that we were trying to match up situational reports coming from the lower formations, where we had the time and the ability, and there were holes in them, trying to follow up the reporting with the headquarters to get more information as it came to hand. Sometimes trying to make notes and go back when a fuller report came through a few days later and linking it through. But a lot of the time we just had to take the things on face value, because the way that we were thinking, going back to this problem of there is so much information out there. What we were trying to do was take the top slice of what we thought was most important, so that then it was there. There was a daily record of what went on in RC South on this particular day.
you could access it, you knew where it were, it had a set of documents related to it. But then it would also provide the key, perhaps, if you then wanted to go and bury into the mirrors of the hard drive that we took every 3 months or every 6 months, where a mirror of the whole system would be taken and stored. And then that operational record then provides the key and the way into sorting through all that other data that's there. And perhaps that's only an interim solution until we get algorithms and software that can do a lot of the sorting for us thereafter. But I just think that doing sorting and arranging and record keeping at the time, at the place where those records are occurring, makes the work of subsequent people a lot easier.
If being a historian is a vocation, and how do you tell that someone has a vocation because they care, then we've been reminded this afternoon that it is a vocation, people do care, and here's a good exemplar of it. Would you please thank Garth?